So there you go. What do you think? We've got about 20 minutes or so, I think, for a sort of discussion. So I can see we've got one chat message up, but was that from me?
That was from me, John. Sorry about that. It was just a clarification around the role of the governance framework and the use of and the role of the governing body. Sorry, just I thought that would be useful.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, Joe. So
one thing from me, John, and it's a question to you on a topic that obviously you covered in some detail around the evolution of services and service providers. Obviously, the sort of decentralized networks that we're talking about are dependent on adoption and consistent change, I suppose, as well. Do you think that the typical commercial mind frame of typical service providers, which might be, big tech, it might be, technological search solution providers, needs to sort of be different in these sort of scenarios? Or do you think, the typical way in which they think about the commerciality of their services and what they can use them for can be used in the same way?
I think that's the essence of the great question. I think, Joe, it's kind of like, I know you didn't phrase it like this, and that's not really maybe what you intend, but it's sort of how can we make good use of what we've got or good money out of this? What's the next kind of business opportunity? And I think you can see some very interesting developments globally. Let's take one example. The market, as we see it right now, is probably sort of split between the niche, bespoke, specialist providers of software and systems that have been working in the space for the last 5+ years. And you might list companies historically like Evan, now part of obviously of us, but others like Exartus and Matter and Trinsic and ID Ramp and whatever else. So those are specialist providers, some of which have a legacy in other systems. So ID Ramp's interesting because it actually has work that's done before in identity and access management systems. But if you look at the other end of the scale, like the Microsofts of this world, Microsoft have actually been just interestingly active for some time now in the decentralized identity space. And they've added verifiable credentials to Active Directory. They've more recently done some work on Entra, which is their sort of decentralized identity proposition. So they're gradually building an argument for their customers, their existing customers, to make use of this technology. And you could think of them as the most obvious example of a centralized kind of environment, but in fact, they're not necessarily. It's better to think about what their motives might be, both good and commercial, in terms of, or good and commercial, in terms of what they are intending to do. So they see this as a future, and they see that there's an opportunity for them to both add services to their customers and to make money out of it. And in a way, they're preventing themselves becoming irrelevant by doing so, by being disintermediated. So the other thing that I think we've both realized in the process of the last few years is that no matter the elegance and beauty of your concept, if you can't kind of get it started, if it's we would call it a catch-22, which is a very old book, if it's a problem which demands that many pieces have to start working all at once before you can do anything, then you've got a real uphill battle to get the commercial entity working. Whereas if you're working with something like a government, they can issue a credential and consume it. So they can actually make use of the things they themselves issue and reduce the cost of their service provision by this verification capability. So there's an economic argument for them on their own, which only gets amplified when they connect to other services and other institutions, other government bodies. It has that wonderful network effect. But they can start with a proposition that makes sense as their own. And many actually large organizations are in the same position. So a large bank can issue things to their own staff or customers. A large university can issue things to their students, alumni, and staff. And it makes sense out of both issuing and consuming. But you have to think of ways in which you don't, I guess, anticipate that the whole market all at once is already up and running, because that just ain't going to happen. So you got to think of a model that sort of makes sense as a startup. I feel like I've stunned everybody. Oh, There we go. We've got a comment. Don Kim. Thank you for thinking my accent is Australian. It's a mixture of all sorts of messy places. But so is there a question? Quite curious. The following: did decentralized provides a chance to change or break the cartel model, sell a business? Okay, what is the reason government should accept DID? And I presume we're meaning sort of decentralized identity or this whole sort of verifiable credential sort of concept. If there's already an existing thing, I think it's a good question. I think I would wonder whether you want to go head to head with government in certain parts of the world as a sort of equivalency modeling. And we also provide identity services. Now, of course, those already exist. So if we look at identity as a very simplistic kind of service, you authenticate the identity of somebody. Government does that, and other institutions do that. And you can imagine that you're competing in a sense with government on that basis. Government has the right to choose whether or not they accept others' authentication, other processes of identifying people. We've got that live issue happening right now in Australia. So I can use the Australian example again. TDIF, Trusted Digital Identity Framework, is a government-sponsored, created, sort of curated environment, federated environment, so which participants can join by going through an accreditation process, and they can have different roles in this market. The government services that you can access, so logging into your health data or your tax data or whatever else you're logging into for government services, the way you log in is the government's own choice. They can choose to accept certain things or not things. At the moment in Australia, they only accept their own. They only accept the sort of what's called MyGov ID as a login process, which comes out of the Australian Tax Office. But they don't accept the other commercial providers that are beginning to be parties on this trusted digital identity framework. So I think governments will always, in a sense, have the right to refuse, subject to democracy and whatever else, laws and so on, but they will pick and choose. The fundamental question is, you have to have a trustworthy enough proposition that enables the parties to go, yeah, that will make economic and kind of social and security sense to rely upon. You can see the beginnings of things like GLIFE, the Global Legal Entity Foundation, I think is the RSF, Joe. I always get along wrong, but GLIFE becoming it's sort of quasi-government. It's not really government. It's based in Switzerland, but it's becoming this international kind of recognition of identities for entities, for organizations, and that governments might then start accepting. So in some instances, they will accept commercial things. I hope that addressed what you're thinking of, Donald. By all means, voice up if you want.
Cool, John. Just one thing from me, and I think this is the realization we've had when working with the government here in Australia, is that if you're dependent on the government to do everything, then it'll be as fast as the government actually sort of moves things forward. Ideally, the government gives this capability to provide services like your digital identity, as far as the government is interested in doing that. If you can combine the digital identity services with other services which rely on other credentials which are not necessarily government issued, then that becomes very powerful. And I think the really cool thing about the decentralized approach to presentation of credentials is that you can actually combine multiple. And then the level of assurance associated with the credentials under which those credentials were issued to you become more trustworthy if they're backed up by government services and other trustworthy services for digital identity. So I think that the Australian approach that's happening in one of the states here is to actually sort of combine them and to allow them to evolve separately, but hopefully coordinated. And I think that's really powerful.
We've long had this, I guess crusade is the wrong word to use. We've long had this this passionate argument that trustworthy digital identity, this is the pithy, the short phrase, a trustworthy digital identity or trustworthy digital identities are essential, but not always necessary. And by which we mean that at times you'll need to prove who you are in certain contexts to certain people or organizations. But actually the proof of other things is really much more important. So this idea that verifiable credentials are a much bigger market opportunity than identity. It is kind of what's at the basis of that idea of digital identity and verifiable credentials. They know that just doing one thing, identity, is not going to do all the things. In fact, if you just do identity, you get some very sort of unintended consequences of just doing identity. All the other stuff still has to reside in the sort of whole in the verifying organization. All the things about everybody and about all their information about people have to now reside within the verifying organization. So you end up with this terrible sort of duplication of information about people all over the place, which we're trying to get away from. Now, there's a question that's being put on the chat by Bodul, which is around, we're all very pleased, by the way, that the W3C has finally kind of ratified, if that's the right word, the decentralized identity core recommendation, the standard that's proposed for decentralized identifiers. So these are the things, if you look at the standard, they're very much like a URI, universal resource identifier. So the construct is DID, the letters DID, colon, colon. And then there's a kind of a location, a place, if you like, for the method. And then there's an address on that place. So the places that a DID might be placed include websites, include distributed ledger technologies, blockchains, other places. But it's a very simple construct. It just says, yeah, I'm a DID. This is where the kind of where I am, which is the method. And then this is the address that you'll find this particular object that I'm pointing to, which is a DID doc in the classic structure. So that DID standard has been around for a while as a sort of lower level approval status for some years, in fact. So when Joe and I started working on this back in sort of 2018, it was already available, if you like, in a sense, as a draft. And it was meant to be approved towards the end of last year. And it got stopped at the last step by 3 very, very large players, 2 of which sort of made some sense, and the third was a bit odd, Mozilla, Google, Apple. We all believe, the community kind of believe, there were rather complicated agendas at play as to why they were blocking this, and they weren't necessarily good agendas, but there were issues. But nevertheless, it got challenged, and brilliantly recently it's been approved. Now, is that going to approve? Is that going to make a difference? You're damn right it does, because whilst the fundamental premise we talk to here is, yes, reliant on current standards, if we've got any kind of experience, we know that 10 years time, 20 years time, 30 years time, there'll be other standards, there'll be other stuff, So what we really should be thinking about is the fundamental model that we're thinking about, decentralized things, and they can be achieved in different ways. But the DID standard is a very important part of the current framework for standards, is very true. And the uncertainty about its status caused all sorts of market uncertainty around implementations using it, allowed, if you like, alternative approaches to argue that, well, it's not even approved yet, and therefore you should use our approach. So it caused destabilization, if you like. So it's great that it's been approved. It will make a significant difference to the confidence with which people can approach this sort of current implementations. And yeah, that's the spec that Joe's just given the link for. There are some you might find some very interesting posts on company sites, like I guess it'd be under Avast now, but Evelyn were sharing some of their views around why it was blocked, and I think they've also shared some views about the good news now that it's been approved. I'll just expand on that just for a bit while we're seeing if anybody else wants to ask a question. One of the competing standards, if you like, and it doesn't really compete because it's kind of different, but the ISO standard for mobile driving licenses has become a kind of frequent topic of conversation in the market, certainly in the Australian market, and in fact in others around the world. And the reason for that is, whilst it's a purpose-built standard for a particular use, which is a mobile driving license, and actually has sort of very detailed, so well-considered detailed thinking around certain ways it works and so on, it allows for the possibility that its contained data object, its MDoc, could be other things than a driving license. The thing is, if you take that approach, you inherit the rest of the stuff that standard comes with, which is the communication protocols and everything else it uses. So there are certain sort of limitations about the way that that MDL standard works, but it comes from a very august, if you like, very kind of rigorous, multi-country, multi-state kind of process of approval. So it's almost the epitome of the open market kind of W3C, IETF kind of world of standards against the more closed environment of ISO, where things get considered in different ways and you have to pay to get the standard. So we were competing in sort of thought experiments with, should we use an ISO MDL model or should we use a W3C? So the ratification of DIDs makes the consideration of W3C's verifiable credential model much easier than would be the case otherwise.
I haven't seen any questions, so I'm going to jump in as well, John. I think one of the discussions that people looking at this space will find is the discussion around interoperability. And as a result, people say, well, we can't do anything because it's not a global standard that everyone's adopting, you know, in the sort of same maturity of things like OIDC. And the more federated models. Now, federated models are typically put in place for identity verification or identification more than anything else, and that's fine. There are some sort of obviously some interesting initiatives around the sort of interoperability between pure OIDC and other things in terms of using verifiable credentials and the verification of data as well. So you will see a lot of talk about, you know, we can't do anything because, you know, it's not interoperable and the rest of it. My concern here is that there are different ways of being interoperable, and interoperability at the sort of messaging protocol sort of type of layer, and the data construct sort of layer, and the governance sort of process is one where there are different ways of being interoperable, and there's no reason why trustworthy data can be, if you like, issued in different ways to support different presentation protocols, and that's exactly what ISO 18013.5 is about. It's actually a presentation standard rather than a complete ecosystem sort of type of standard, which is where trust over IP is sort of trying to play, and that's fine. So you know, the ability for an issuer to issue an MDoc might be they might also be able to issue verifiable credentials, classical verifiable credentials in different formats as well. So for different reasons and so forth. But I see also there's a question, so I'm going to shut up.
That now point is, we'll go to the question in a second. But I think that's a very good point, Joe. But in a sense, that's our luxury as Sezoo, is we can work with a client and consider, well, you can do an and here. As a product provider, you often need to kind of put your hat in a ring in a certain way. You can only invest in a certain direction. But I as a product provider, I might be building a platform based on W3C, VCs, and DIDs, and I might not be able to afford right now to also invest in creating a parallel kind of capability for ISO MDL. So it may be that it's just kind of to which one do I go for? So that's the challenge for product providers. You know, you can be a brilliant niche player. The answer to that question that Joe's already given is interoperability. Whatever you do, build something that allows others to connect to it. Don't build a silo, because that's the antithesis of what this whole thing is about. Now, Ben's asked a really good question, or sort of picked me up on the phrase I used. Okay, so I probably need to explain a bit more about what I meant. I said that trustworthy digital identities, plural, are essential, but not always necessary. But by which I mean, at any point in time, or at points in time, we might each need to prove who we are to complete a transaction. So literally who we are at a very kind of a level of authentication that's sort of very high potentially, or at least relevant to the context of the transaction we're doing. Now, what our point is, you don't always need to prove who you are. So the models that we tend to propose are ones where I might need to prove that I'm over 18, for example, to gain access to a service, but the service provider doesn't need to literally know who I am. They just need to know that the person asking for the service is over 18. They don't need to know my date of birth, my name, and my address. They just need to know I'm over 18. So that's why we're using this idea of trustworthy digital identities are essential, but not always necessary. In other words, we all need to have access to them at times, but we don't always. In fact, we should be very cautious of any system, in fact, very push back on any system that demands we always prove who we are before we can do something like buy a coffee. or buy a concert ticket or something, because then we've got into this world of surveillance and correlation risk and all the other things. So I think that, Ben, you're referring to the sort of the IDAS type initiatives and maybe SIF lab kind of work. That's probably right. So you're seeing the exact opposite. I'm not sure I understand why that's the opposite. Am I wrong in thinking it's opposite, Ben?
So, hello. Can I just jump in and explain myself a little bit?
Yeah.
So I'm from Eurocom, and we're working in different consortia within Germany, predominantly looking at like public sector use cases, but also some private sector or private sector, public sector intersecting use cases. So, for example, there's one in particular. It's a library. So the library wants to issue a library credential instead of a library card, so that users of the library can loan books with a verifiable credential instead of a library card. So in the statute of the library, it is written that like a government ID is required. So when we look at the ecosystem of government IDs in Germany, we have the like digital identity card, which contains a hardware-based secure element. So now we have a very strong lobby for this kind of card and for the system it uses within Germany. So this means for all these use cases like a library, we get this argument that you can use the hardware-based secure element ensured identity, which is provided by the government, which is very expensive for service providers, relying parties, as well as the holder who actually have to obtain this card to use, because there's one could say a lot of so there are just a few providers who are trusted and notified in providing these services. And the argument goes that you can use the government ID, even though it's expensive, it's clunky, it doesn't give a good user experience, and the level of assurance, the level of security it provides might not be necessary for a library use case. But you can use it because you get if you want this data from the digital identity, but from the card, you need a certificate, and the certificate can prohibit you from actually receiving certain data. So when you were born, or what your gender is, because you don't need it. So you have to prove that you need this information in order to obtain the certificate. So this is an argument brought forward against SSI or verifiable credentials, because the argument goes, we have this very good, very secure solution. Why should we change?
That's a great example, Ben. It's got lots of layers to it. As sort of the thinking, I suppose. You've got, from what I'm hearing, you've got understandable kind of motives by certain players. So if you're a hardware secure environment sort of card manufacturer, you'll want your market to persist. You'll want to argue for the reasons why that product should still carry on. And in fact, that's not necessarily antithetical or against the idea of self-sovereign entity. I mean, a possible future exists where we carry multiple kind of tokens that are effectively hardware secure elements with different kind of credentials on them. We use each of these for different things. So we don't use a phone, a general purpose smart computer environment with verifiable credentials, but we use a kind of physical instances, if you like, of cards that can contain things. But the core of what we're talking about here is the current legislature demands that a government identity is used to borrow a book, say, and it does challenge that current legislature. We found the same in New South Wales. There were instances where the way that the acts were written demanded a certain thing occur, like physical presence to gain a thing. And that immediately means you can't do remote, because the law says you have to be physically present to do this thing. Now, the question then is it economically valuable enough to change the law to enable these new things? And that's the essence of what we're trying to do with these economic value models. So we would kind of say, okay, let's see how the arguments stack up. If we carry on with the card-based single government identity, which is costly and complex, but it maybe needs to exist. What's the downside of using that thing for things where it's probably overkill to, say, borrow a book? And unless we can construct a good enough argument that says it's significant overkill and we're losing kind of market opportunity, unfortunately it persists. So we have to, you kind of have to work out ways to consider that argument and overcome it with hopefully logic, but also a little bit of passion often. But you kind of have to think about ways to argue that it should be changed, to simplify. Most governments are willing, that's a bit too sweeping a statement. Many governments are willing to consider ways to simplify government, to reduce the complexity for citizens, to reduce the burden of government, to make it easier, but no less secure or safe for citizens. That's typically an argument most of them would say they adhere to, whatever spectrum they're on in terms of political belief. So that's often a way of going about it. We can make it simpler with no more risk for citizens if we do it this way. It's a difficult question though, Ben. I mean,
no, it's exactly right, John. The thing I would also add to that is obviously there's an embedded investment already into that ecosystem, and if it's changing people's minds or extending that is what we're talking about, not replacing it. It can operate at where it needs to operate, and the idea that we've been proposing to various different ID providers, whether they're government, pseudo-government, or commercial, is that if you were to issue a verifiable credential, in addition to the mechanism you do today, it actually makes their economic value extend extremely fast. And then, as I said before, the value and the reach of those services that they can actually underpin evolve in a decentralized way, as well as the interactions. So you can actually allow other organizations to create ecosystems using their generated verifiable credentials, but their fundamental processes don't change. You have to onboard someone, you have to identify them, and then the question is, what do you do with what you've done? And that's the important thing.
Absolutely right, Joe. There's a sort of another way. There are classic sort of strategies. You can go right back to Sun Tzu's Art of War and stuff. But there's some classic ways of thinking about how you might compete with such a situation. And one of them is not to go head to head, not to try and say, no, we don't need to use the government HSE environment. We can use verifiable credentials. So I've got a phone ring. That's difficult. Okay, we've already sort of discussed why that might be difficult, but what might be worthwhile doing. The other way of doing it is to say, well, okay, maybe we have to currently, under legislature and everything else, use this particular credential to prove who we are to borrow a book, but maybe we only do that once. Maybe the result of that process is a verifiable credential that's issued to us by the library saying, here's your library card. Yeah, and now whenever you come to the library, you present your library card because you once upon a time proved who you were to us, and we verified that, and we bound it to you, and all sorts of complicated cryptographic magic has happened. But now we're able to use this library card, which doesn't have all of that kind of sensitive information that might be present in your government ID. So we can potentially think of ways that we don't go head to head, but we kind of do a jujitsu type move and allow that, okay, that comes in, but we're going to do the verified credential because it adds value in another way, and we can have a whole sophisticated library card thing. And over time, you erode the need for the government ID. You kind of, you gradually erode it rather than go head to head with it. And that could be another way of thinking about the problem. We are over time, I noticed, by about 7 minutes, and many of you are kind of working later in the day. I'll sort of call that out now. So I'm very happy to take any kind of last questions. And I'll leave a gap when I've said that for a bit. So I'm going to take the silence to mean there probably aren't any last questions, but so Joe and I are very, very happy to take kind of follow-up. No worries, Ben. Yeah, very, very happy to take follow-up discussion or questions. We're very accessible. We're fascinated by this whole topic. It's a passionate sort of and commercial play for us at Sezoo. So So by all means, sort of reach out to us on, you've got our Twitter, our LinkedIn, you've probably got our email addresses even from this as well. So, and our website allows you to sort of ask questions of us, but we don't capture personal details on our website. But thank you very much, guys.
Just one thing, John, and it's up to, I'm assuming, Benny, about the slides and sharing the slides.
Well, what we could do, Joe, is Benny, I think, has already shared the slides. I did a couple of tweaks to make them slightly better. But what I could do is do a LinkedIn post where I share the slides through LinkedIn so that they're available as a PDF. And that might be the easiest way for people to find us. We can also put them on our website if people want to find them there. And that, that could be, we could do both, I suppose.
That's great.
Yeah, we'll do both. We'll put them on our website and we'll do a post on LinkedIn where we'll share the PDF. Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to let you guys get on with your evenings probably, and I'll get on with my day. So thank you.